Most people think comfort is a reward, something you earn, something you deserve after working hard, after making money, after doing things right. And at first, that seems reasonable. You work more, you earn more, you try to make your life easier, less stress, more stability, more predictability. That's the goal, or at least, that's what most people believe the goal is. But here's the part that almost nobody questions. What if the thing you call financial comfort is the exact reason your wealth never grows? Because comfort feels safe. But in reality, comfort is one of the most expensive financial positions you can hold, not because it costs you money immediately, but because of what it quietly prevents. The opportunities you don't take, the risks you never evaluate, the decisions you postpone, the growth you never expose yourself to. And the most dangerous part is this: you don't feel the loss. There is no alarm, no visible mistake, no obvious failure. Just a slow, silent separation between where your money is and where it could have been. That gap is invisible in the present, but over time it becomes enormous, and by the time you notice it, it's usually too late to fully recover. Because wealth is not built in moments of comfort. It's built in moments of calculated discomfort, moments where uncertainty exists, where outcomes are not guaranteed, where the decision feels slightly uncomfortable, but strategically necessary. And most people avoid those moments, not because they are irrational, but because their brain is doing exactly what it was designed to do: protect them from uncertainty, from volatility, from loss, from the unknown. And that protection system works perfectly for survival, but not for wealth. Because the same mechanism that keeps you safe also keeps you small. And this is where the pattern begins. You don't actively choose to stay financially stuck. You don't wake up and decide to limit your growth. You simply follow what feels reasonable. You keep your money where it feels stable. You avoid decisions that feel uncertain. You prioritize predictability over potential, and slowly, without realizing it, you build a financial life optimized for comfort, not for growth. At first, nothing seems wrong. Your bills are paid, your income is stable, your financial situation feels under control, and control feels good. Control creates the illusion of progress, but control is not growth. And this is the first fracture most people ever see, because financial stability and financial growth are not the same thing. In fact, they often require opposite behaviors. Stability prioritizes protection. Growth requires exposure. Stability minimizes volatility. Growth depends on it. Stability avoids uncertainty. Growth is built inside it. And the more you optimize your life for comfort, the more you unconsciously eliminate the conditions required for wealth to compound. This is why so many intelligent, disciplined, hard-working people remain financially stuck for years. Not because they are making catastrophic mistakes, but because they are avoiding the conditions where meaningful growth happens. And avoidance doesn't feel like a mistake. It feels like responsibility, like maturity, like prudence, which makes the pattern even more dangerous, because it's not perceived as a problem, it's perceived as the correct behavior, and that's exactly why it persists, because the pattern is reinforced by everything around you. Your environment rewards stability. Your peers validate safe decisions. Your culture promotes security as the ultimate goal. And over time, you internalize a simple rule: if it feels safe, it must be right. But in financial reality, that rule is deeply flawed, because safety in the short term often creates risk in the long term, and comfort today can become limitation tomorrow. But that connection is not immediate. It unfolds slowly, quietly, over years, which is why most people never connect their current comfort with their future financial stagnation. They see the outcome, but they don't see the pattern that created it, and without seeing the pattern, they can't change it. They assume the problem is income, or timing, or opportunity, but rarely they question comfort, because comfort doesn't look like the enemy. It looks like success. It looks like having things under control. It looks like doing life correctly. And that's the illusion. Because the same system that makes you feel Safe can quietly disconnect you from financial growth, not through dramatic mistakes, but through consistent avoidance, and avoidance compounds, just like growth does. Every time you delay a decision, every time you choose certainty over opportunity, every time you prioritize emotional comfort over strategic positioning, you reinforce the same pattern, and patterns, when repeated long enough, become identity. You start to see yourself as someone who is careful, responsible, not risky. And those labels feel positive, but they come with hidden consequences, because at some point, being careful stops protecting you and starts limiting you. And this transition is almost impossible to detect in real time, because nothing breaks, nothing collapses, nothing signals that something is wrong. Your life continues, your income continues, your comfort continues, but your growth doesn't. And that's the trade most people make without realizing it. They exchange long-term expansion for short-term emotional stability, not once, but repeatedly. And repetition is what makes the cost irreversible, because wealth is not determined by isolated decisions. It is determined by patterns sustained over time. And when your pattern is built around avoiding discomfort, your financial trajectory becomes predictable, not immediately, but inevitably, because you are systematically removing yourself from the environments where wealth is created, not because you lack access, but because those environments feel uncomfortable, uncertain, unfamiliar, and your brain interprets that as risk. So you stay where things feel known, where outcomes feel controlled, where nothing surprises you, and slowly, your financial world becomes smaller, more predictable, more stable, but also more limited. And this is where the real cost of comfort begins to appear, not as a visible loss, but as an invisible absence. Because when people think about losing money, they imagine something concrete: a bad investment, a failed business, a market crash, something that can be pointed at and labeled as a mistake. But the most expensive financial losses rarely look like that. They look like opportunities that were never taken, paths that were never explored, decisions that were quietly postponed until they disappeared. And the problem with missed opportunities is simple. They don't leave evidence. There is no record of what could have happened. No statement showing the returns you didn't generate. No graph displaying the growth you never allowed, which makes the cost psychologically invisible. And what is invisible is almost impossible to correct, because you can't fix what you don't perceive as a problem. So the pattern continues. You keep optimizing your life for comfort. You keep avoiding friction. You keep making decisions that feel reasonable in the moment, and each one of those decisions seems harmless, insignificant, justified. But when repeated over years, they create a very specific financial structure, a structure where your money behaves passively, where it sits instead of moves, where it protects instead of expands, where it survives but doesn't grow. And survival is not wealth. Survival is maintenance. Wealth requires movement. It requires exposure. It requires the willingness to accept temporary discomfort in exchange for long-term expansion. And this is where most people disconnect from the process, because they are not avoiding growth consciously. They are avoiding discomfort instinctively. And that instinct is powerful, stronger than logic, stronger than knowledge, stronger than intention, because it operates below awareness. It doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't present options. It simply pushes you toward what feels safe and pulls you away from what feels uncertain, which means that even if you understand how wealth is built, you may still behave in a way that prevents it, because understanding a system is not the same as operating inside it. And this creates one of the most frustrating financial experiences. You know what you should do, but you don't do it, not because you lack discipline, but because your internal system is calibrated for comfort, not for growth. And that calibration affects everything: the way you evaluate risk, the way you interpret uncertainty, the way you react to volatility, the way you position your money. You start to favor decisions that minimize emotional discomfort, even if they reduce financial potential. And over time, this becomes your default behavior, your automatic response, your financial identity. You become someone who waits for certainty, avoids ambiguity, prefers stability over opportunity. And this identity feels correct. It feels responsible. It feels aligned with what society defines as financial intelligence. But in reality, it is often the opposite. Because real financial intelligence is not about avoiding risk completely. It's about understanding which risks are necessary, which risks are strategic, which risks are asymmetrical, and most importantly, which risks you are avoiding that are costing you more than taking them ever would. This is where the second layer of the pattern becomes visible, because comfort doesn't just limit action, it distorts perception. It changes how you interpret reality. You begin to see safe options as smart and uncertain options as dangerous, even when the data suggests the opposite, even when history suggests the opposite, even when logic suggests the opposite. Because your perception is not being guided by objective evaluation, it is being guided by emotional calibration. And emotional calibration prioritizes one thing above all: avoiding discomfort, not maximizing growth. And this creates a subtle but critical distortion. You start to confuse volatility with loss, movement with danger, change with risk. When in reality, those elements are often required for wealth to expand. Markets move. Opportunities fluctuate. Value shifts over time. And if your system is designed to avoid all of that, you automatically position yourself outside of growth, not because you made a bad decision, but because you removed yourself from the game entirely, and you did it in a way that feels intelligent, which is why the pattern is so difficult to break, because it doesn't feel like self-sabotage. It feels like discipline. It feels like control. It feels like doing the right thing. And when a behavior feels right, you don't question it. You repeat it, again and again, until it becomes automatic, until it becomes identity, until it becomes invisible. And once a pattern becomes invisible, it becomes permanent, unless something forces you to see it. And for many people, that moment never comes. They continue operating inside the same comfort-driven framework for years, even decades. And the financial consequences accumulate quietly, not in dramatic spikes, but in steady underperformance, in missed compounding, in opportunities that pass by unnoticed, in capital that never reaches its potential. And eventually, the gap becomes visible, but not as a clear cause and effect, not as a single mistake, but as a general feeling, a sense that something is off, that despite working hard, despite being consistent, that despite doing everything right, the results don't match the effort. And that is one of the most dangerous moments in the entire pattern, because at that point, most people look for external explanations. They blame income, they blame timing, they blame the economy, they blame access. But rarely, they question the one variable that has been constant the entire time, their relationship with comfort, because questioning comfort feels uncomfortable, and the system is designed to avoid exactly that. So instead of adjusting the pattern, they reinforce it, they double down on safety, they become even more conservative, even more controlled, even more resistant to uncertainty, which only deepens the problem, because now the system is not just passive, it's defensive, actively rejecting the conditions required for growth. And at that point, the pattern is fully locked, not because change is impossible, but because change requires discomfort. And discomfort is exactly what the system has been avoiding all along. And this is the moment where the pattern reveals its final layer, because up to this point, comfort has been operating as a silent filter, shaping your decisions, limiting your exposure, distorting your perception. But now it does something even more dangerous. It rewrites your definition of progress. You begin to measure success not by growth, but by stability, not by expansion, but by the absence of problems, not by what your money is becoming, but by how little it fluctuates. And this shift is subtle, almost invisible, but it changes everything. Because once stability becomes your primary metric, growth becomes optional. And optional growth, rarely happens. Because growth is inconvenient, it requires attention, it requires decision-making, it requires emotional tolerance, it requires you to engage with uncertainty repeatedly. And if your system is calibrated to avoid all of that, you naturally deprioritize it, not consciously but behaviorally. You focus on maintaining what you have instead of expanding it. You protect your current position instead of improving it. You optimize for preservation instead of multiplication. And over time, this creates a very specific financial outcome, one where nothing goes terribly wrong, but nothing goes meaningfully right either. You don't lose everything, but you also don't build anything significant. You exist in a controlled middle, a stable plateau. And that plateau feels safe, comfortable, predictable, but it has a hidden characteristic. It doesn't lead anywhere, because wealth is not built by staying in the same position. It is built by moving through phases. Phases of uncertainty, phases of volatility, phases where the outcome is not guaranteed. And if you eliminate those phases entirely, you eliminate the possibility of meaningful growth. This is why comfort is so deceptive, because it gives you a sense of control, while quietly removing your ability to scale. It creates the illusion of progress, while freezing your actual trajectory. And the longer you stay inside that system, the harder it becomes to leave it, because your tolerance for discomfort decreases over time. Your sensitivity to uncertainty increases, your need for control becomes stronger, and eventually, even small deviations from stability feel threatening. Even small risks feel unnecessary. Even small opportunities feel uncomfortable. And at that point, you are no longer choosing comfort. Comfort is choosing for you. It dictates your decisions. It defines your boundaries. It determines your financial behavior. And when behavior becomes constrained like that, outcomes become predictable, not in the short term, but in the long term, because the system you operate inside always produces the same type of result. And a system built around avoiding discomfort cannot produce exponential growth. It can only produce controlled stability. And controlled stability has a ceiling, a limit, a point where improvement slows down and eventually stops. And most people reach that point without realizing it. They just feel it, a plateau, a stagnation, a sense that things are not getting worse but also not getting better. And that feeling is often misinterpreted. They think they need more income, more effort, more time. But the real issue is structural. Their system is not designed for growth. It's designed for comfort. And systems determine outcomes, not intentions, not knowledge, not effort, structure. And this leads to one of the most uncomfortable realizations in personal finance. Your problem may not be what you are doing wrong. It may be what you are consistently avoiding. The conversations you don't have, the decisions you delay, the risks you never evaluate, the environments you don't enter, the discomfort you refuse to experience, because those avoided moments are often the exact moments where growth begins. And without them, nothing changes. You stay in the same loop, the same structure, the same trajectory, and years pass, without dramatic failure, but also without meaningful expansion, and eventually the cost becomes visible, not as a sudden collapse, but as a realization, a moment where you look back and see the gap between what you have and what you could have built, between your effort and your outcome, between your potential and your reality. And that gap is not random. It is the accumulated result of thousands of small decisions, all aligned in the same direction, toward comfort, away from discomfort, toward stability, away from uncertainty, toward control, away from growth. And once you see that pattern clearly, the interpretation changes. It's no longer about luck, or timing, or external conditions. It becomes something much more precise, much more uncomfortable, much more actionable, because the pattern is internal, which means it can be changed, but only if you are willing to confront it. Not intellectually, behaviorally, which means stepping into situations that don't feel comfortable, making decisions without full certainty, accepting volatility as part of the process, redefining what safe actually means, because real financial safety is not the absence of movement, it is the presence of growth, it is the ability to expand your capital over time, to adapt, to reposition, to evolve, and that requires exposure, not avoidance. It requires engagement, not withdrawal. It requires discomfort, not comfort. And this is the final inversion most people never make. They spend years trying to eliminate discomfort from their financial life, when in reality, that discomfort is the entry point to growth. Not all discomfort is useful. Not all risk is intelligent. But the complete absence of discomfort is almost always a signal of stagnation. Because growth feels different. It feels uncertain. It feels unstable. It feels slightly uncomfortable. And that discomfort is not a warning sign, it is a signal that you are operating outside your default pattern, a signal that you are expanding your range, a signal that something is changing. And change is where wealth is built, not in the familiar, not in the predictable, not in the comfortable, but in the space where your current system no longer feels sufficient, and you are forced to evolve. That is where the trajectory shifts. That is where the compounding begins. That is where the gap closes. But only if you are willing to enter that space, because no amount of knowledge, no amount of intention, no amount of effort can compensate for a system designed to avoid discomfort. And that is the core of the pattern. Comfort is not neutral, it is directional. And if left unchecked, it always points away from growth, quietly, consistently, predictably. And that is why comfort is expensive.